All right. So, hi everyone. My name is Tal, and I'm going to talk about Deep500, which is a group effort here at the Scalable Parallel Computing Lab. Many different people working on this. I'm going to briefly overview just a few of the things that we can achieve with Deep500, and you can look more on the website if you're interested. So let's start with a brief introduction to supervised deep learning. Should be on the same page. What we have as an input is in supervised learning a data set and also a model. And we normally take a mini batch of samples, so essentially a few samples from that data set, and feed it to the model, get some result. In this case, this is a classification problem, so we want to understand what is in the picture. Compare that with the true label found in the dataset and make updates on the model accordingly. Now we run this in sequence many times over, often going over the dataset multiple times as well. We have this model composed of two parts. One part is the structure of the neural network itself. This is where deep learning comes in. And the other part is the weights that we are learning and updating. We do not only want to update the weight with respect to the data set that we have here called X, but we actually want to optimize that with respect to the true distribution of the data D. So this creates an interesting optimization problem where our goal is to generalize, so beyond what we see in the data set. There are different kind of loss functions that we use as objectives for the optimization. So in regression problems, we would normally use maybe the squared loss, or in classification problems, we might use cross entropy. For more details, refer you to an excellent survey at the bottom of the screen right here. Now, looking at this from a more computational perspective, today, these data sets that we're seeing here are quite large. Actually, they are terabytes to tens of terabytes, for example, in YouTube dataset, and even hundreds of terabytes for scientific computing applications. And we all have to access them when we're doing the deep neural network training randomly, which creates a very interesting problem of I/O. The models themselves are becoming larger and larger. Some of the models today, especially in transformer networks, cannot be contained even in one GPU device. So we are essentially forced to use distributed computation. And as for the labels that we're training with, in scientific data sets like ImageNet, we have 1,000 labels, 22,000 labels for transformers, for sequence transduction and translation. We have 30,000 labels. And if you think about problems like face recognition, we can only assume that there are problems with billions of these labels. So in essence, this training process takes a lot of time and compute resources and is very much like any other supercomputing problem, and we should treat it as such. So looking deeper into deep learning, essentially, we want to break down what are the computational principles that we have. So at the bottom level of what deep learning is, we have the operators. Operators like a convolution, for instance, are the building blocks of those deep neural networks that we're computing. And there are many optimization opportunities there. Apart from operators, they essentially compose a graph that we can look at the parallelization of and the optimization between different operators. These networks are then part of a training process, which reads data from some store and updates parameters from another store. And this training process itself can be distributed across multiple nodes. All in all, these are, well, 4 different levels in which you can look at deep learning. And as deep learning is a very highly researched field, if we look even deeper on the concepts, there are so many approaches and different ways to optimize these different parts. So from convolutions, which you can compute in at least 15 different ways, and transformers here in operators where there are modules composed of submodules composed of submodules composed of tensor contractions. In the networks themselves, we have deep neural network compilers that use technology like MLIR or other optimizing compilers in order to create interesting transformations on a whole network. And the networks themselves can be mapped in various different ways across GPUs or TPUs or any different hardware that you can think of. Even training is not just training. So this process that I mentioned in the beginning about looping over samples in a data set, that really is something that changes from problem to problem, right? So some of the problems, they're not using first order optimization. So sometimes they have to sample more samples and sometimes have to no samples at all. And in other network structures, we have the generative adversarial networks, which have a completely different way of training, and the list goes on and on. For distributed training, this is where it gets really interesting from an HPC perspective, in my opinion, because you can make interesting relaxations on the composition of the problem. So essentially, if you have parameters in one node and you have maybe another set of parameters on another node, they don't have to maintain synchrony all the time. So you can ask yourself different questions, and those the answers to those questions lead to different optimization algorithms. Who is coordinating the optimization? What are we transferring? Maybe we're quantizing or taking a subset of the results for transferring. And how often do we synchronize? And all of these questions lead to different training algorithms, different convergence properties, and so on. Looking at the networks today, so this table is actually taken from the time of publication of the paper, so I assume that there are at least 10 more neural network frameworks that we do not cover in this table. We try to look at those different features that I mentioned before and try to categorize who is supporting what. And surprisingly, even the larger frameworks don't support every configuration possible. So to be precise, customizing operators is not something that every framework really easily allows you to do. Network representation that is, could be something that you present as a graph or something that you just run through as eager execution. Representing in data sets, this is something that, there is no standard format for a data set, especially when you work on different types of data, like, on one hand, videos, on the other hand, the cosmology data. The training algorithms, as I mentioned, they're not equivalent, and distributed training, all of these different concepts are things that usually the people who are writing papers in these topics, they sometimes they have to resort to implementing something of their own, which limits the flexibility, but also limits the reproducibility in deep learning. So what we want to do with Deep500 is to try to understand how can we benchmark and have reproducible deep learning in even distributed environments. And to answer that question, first we must ask ourselves, what are the metrics that we're even benchmarking? So this can be categorized into 3 different parts, sometimes completely orthogonal. So the first is correctness. We want to understand where we end up in. How much do we generalize? Are our operators correct? Do we have any bias in the way that we're sampling the data set? Because that might hurt the convergence properties in what I mentioned in the first slide, where we actually have to train for the data distribution, the true data distribution. So this is one way to benchmark a specific model and data set. The other way to benchmark is by time to solution, convergence, right? So this means either the absolute time, the time you spend training, or this might also mean the number of iterations that you spend. So this is a very important machine learning concept, that if you can spend fewer iterations and make more progress in terms of convergence, this is an interesting conclusion on its own for different optimizers. The third one is performance. So, from starting down at the bottom with the throughput of how many samples can we feed to a neural network and get a result, through getting a complete breakdown of where we're spending all of our time, how much energy we're consuming, and all the way up to distributed training where we want to just measure communication volume. These all relate to the performance of a specific step or set of steps. And so looking at the benchmarks that currently exist online, we have benchmarks like DeepBench, which is essentially a benchmark for optimizing individual operators, and it only measures the performance of those individual operators. On the other hand, we have benchmarks like Kaggle, which are websites that they give you a data set and then you have to train to get the best test score. And so this is only about the correctness of the result in the end, the final accuracy. And you have benchmarks like DawnBench, which measure how fast you can get to a certain accuracy or certain test accuracy. And what we intend to do with the Deep500 is to allow all of these features and all of these correctness metrics, all of these benchmarking metrics to be represented as part of a more standardized way to look at deep learning. And so what we see here is, all the checkboxes in Deep500 are checked, but MLPerf is actually coming pretty close. And we're working with MLPerf to see exactly how we can combine those two approaches. Now, I mentioned a lot about the background, but then how do we really standardize deep learning? I mean, there are a lot of layers, and it seems like anyone can do anything in any one of these layers. Right, so what we propose in this work is a deep learning meta framework. So not a framework that does the optimization, but a framework for frameworks. So essentially a collection of interfaces that can work with the neural network or deep learning frameworks and integrate with them and even allow them to interoperate with each other. And this is something that is built in 4 different layers. And these layers coincide with the levels that I mentioned before in deep learning computational principles. The first and foremost, lowest layer is the operator itself, where we need a standardized definition of what an operator in a network is. And for that, it's quite a simple interface where you have an operator type and you have the computation of forward pass or a gradient. And to dive a bit into this operator interface, what we provide in Deep500 is something that is very easily extensible and works with large deep neural network frameworks like TensorFlow and PyTorch and Caffe2. As you can see here in the Python interface, if we want to invent a new operator, which is integer power, all we have to do is implement those 2 methods, and the system would use either the tensor operators that exist already in the existing frameworks, or would invoke the forward and gradient functions with NumPy arrays. Now, for C++, we also provide the same interface where you can, with the, let's say, comparable ease, define forward and backward passes and do pretty much anything on those. And as you can see here, it just accepts the pointers. What Deep500 does in the background is integrate with all of these deep neural network frameworks and provide the right hooks so that this custom operator that you implemented in C++ is going to be a block in your network structure, whether it is a graph or something that is eagerly executed. For benchmarking, I mentioned DeepBench before as a benchmark for performance. So the entire DeepBench benchmark is, in fact, in Deep500. And it is actually 2 Python files containing a list of these configurations, as you can see here. And based on our benchmarking infrastructure, we can create very interesting plots. For instance, you can see here the distribution of runtime of all of the implementations in the different frameworks of the convolution and the matrix multiplication benchmarks. You can also see that you can measure the overhead of certain frameworks just by looking at the difference between those and the native deep bench call. So moving on up from level 0, we go to the network itself. So in the network evaluation, we take the operators and we group them into a graph structure where the operator types are standardized using Onyx, which is a format that I will get to in a bit, and providing a graph object-oriented interface that we can use to add nodes and manipulate this graph. And this graph is then executed, and separately from the operators, this executor takes a network, and with one function call, so the interface of the executor is a one function call called inference, or inference and backprop, and feeding and then fetching tensors from those graphs in order to allow for graph-wide optimizations. So in between operators, perhaps you can use XLA to compile these graphs together. So diving into this layer a bit deeper, the Onyx format is what we chose as a standard definition of what an operator is and how to represent graphs. That is actually a very widely adopted format that many of the existing frameworks have interfaces to and from. So it's very easy to save a PyTorch module into an Onyx graph and so on. The Onyx format is not that complex. Onyx format is a graph-based representation where you have a model that contains a graph. It can have a selection of, as far as I've counted today, 170 different operators, which is quite small compared to 1,000, order of 1,000 operators that you might have in TensorFlow. And this graph has nodes, initializers, and inputs and outputs that you can feed and fetch from. So the interface, the graph interface that we built, is very closely related to the Onyx graph. And as you can see, Onyx even has a visualization tool. This is taken from Netron. This is what a ResNet 50, this is a neural network, building blocks look like. And you can see here that this is composed of the standardized operators connected by edges representing the tensors that are outputs of a certain operator and inputs of another. And we were working closely with the Onyx training working group in order to provide a general interface for training so that you can, in Onyx, represent also a full training pipeline. So what we ended up doing is providing suggestions for how to initialize and how to update during training. And now this is integrated in Onyx. So Onyx also has a native training support, which we integrate with Deep500. Now, moving up to executors, what we can do with the whole program execution. So this is one example, is, for instance, running a whole network on an FPGA. So taking the Deep500 neural network execution graph, we can compile that with our interfaces that we provide and create the OpenCL files to run through an Intel FPGA. Another thing that we can do is network manipulation. So based on our object-oriented network interface, which is based on Onyx, we can take a graph and essentially run transformations on it. So here we can see a convolution that we convert into a split, followed by multiple convolutions, followed by a concatenate with different parameters. And this is a result of a different work that you can see here, microQDNN, that we implemented as a simple graph transformation. And the results are that it can be quite faster than standard evaluation of the same convolution operation. In training, we provide a set of interfaces to support supervised, unsupervised, and reinforcement learning. So we start with a data set, for instance, that has to come from a different source. Here we have a very simple operation. The interface just get at a certain point I. We separate that from a sampler, which essentially samples the data set in different ways. So you can separate data augmentation, prefetching, different ways to sample the data, all on those two interfaces. On the top level here, we have an optimizer. So here we don't limit the definition of an optimizer to what most deep learning frameworks do. An optimizer is a simple interface that has one function called minimize. And this runs everything. So from the first order SGD optimizers that you might see, that we also have an extension for where we have steps, but also second order optimizers, zero order optimizers, even genetic algorithms can be run with the same optimizer interface. And the unit that controls everything together to create a full training pipeline for training and validation and hyperparameters is called a trainer. It receives an optimizer, an executor, and one or two samplers, depending if you have a validation set or not, and has a function called train. And there you can really implement the different features of training procedures. For instance, progressive growing. So show a couple of results that we have just by having these interfaces. We can measure the HPC aspect of I/O. So here we can see how we load data in various formats and different prefetching methods. And we can see that on a single node, we can measure the performance here. And on distributed, we can measure the contention on a parallel file system. And so Deep500 makes all of these measurements and experimentation very easy. For optimizers, we can create from an algorithm that we see on a paper. So this is a paper called Executor, and you see that the algorithm is around 5 or 6 lines, and our version in Python is not that much further to that. It's 30 lines, and already can be integrated into any deep learning framework, just because we use these interfaces and combine everything together to the whole training pipeline. And the results, the full results are in the paper. I'm not going to go into the details here, but it is also interesting to see that using Deep500, we can see the metrics of the accuracy and the time to convergence and all of the things that I mentioned before. There are metrics that you can plug in. So onto the final layer. So as I mentioned with samplers, we have a distributed sampler. So this is the way to extend and customize the interaction with parallel file systems. And a distributed optimizer, which includes all of the things that I mentioned before about the model consistency between the nodes and the centralization of who is governing the optimization process. And here there was a very interesting work that we are currently doing about trying to generalize an interface to distributed optimizers, and we use Deep500 as a vehicle for that. And as you can see here, we test a wide variety of SGD algorithms and categorize them into specific classes and create the right abstractions for their optimization, their distributed optimization. And the end result is that the distributed optimizer interface can use any optimizer, and with our interfaces that we describe in the paper, can just change the way that we synchronize the parameters. So if you want a gradient averaging optimizer, we here synchronize all the gradients. If you want a model averaging optimizer, we move this sync all here to the param line, and now we have a model averaging optimizer. And this, again, works with all the different frameworks. Now, in the same way that we write operators in level 0, we can use that to write an optimizer as a custom operator in C++. So what you can see here, very short, this is the entire code that you need in order to perform a, well, decentralized optimizer Okay, so Horovod-like, allreduce-based, synchronous SGD optimizer with a group size of P, where all processors communicate. And the results are that using this very simple interface, we insert, because it's inserted as operators, we can insert control dependencies, as you can see here, and we don't need a management environment like Horovod has, which in turn contributes to very high scaling capabilities. So this very simple optimizer is the one that performs the fastest in TensorFlow version that we tested in the paper. Moreover, we can use the same interface and we use the same interface to implement SparCML, which is another paper that essentially extends the communication to use a sparse allreduce with quantized values, where not every node contributes the same gradients, and more details are available in that paper. And as you can see, the communication pattern is quite complex, but the implementation is this very simple C++ operator that now you can plug into PyTorch or TensorFlow without any extra effort. And in that, increase the scalability of learning for certain configurations. Overall, this set of interfaces, this meta framework, we find to be quite general in the wide range of applications that deep learning right now covers. And by plugging in metrics into every one of those interfaces designed as hooks for before and after certain processes, we are able to create very expressive measurements in terms of, as I said, communication volume, runtime, performance, breakdowns, and even the bias in the dataset sampling. And so to combine all of these to an actual benchmark, we try to understand what really constitutes a benchmark. So what you can see here is what we ended up with, that in order to define a benchmark where multiple implementations can compete, what we need is a set of fixed definitions, right? So for instance, I don't know, we're training on a certain data set. So that would be fixed. A set of mutable definitions, which is where the implementations can compete, and an acceptable metric set. So the metrics can be performance, time to convergence, or even final accuracy. And if you have all of these together, that is what's called a recipe. So with a Deep500 meta framework, a recipe is defined as a very short Python file here that defines the fixed components. So here the model is an ONNX file, so resdet, and we have specific data sets also fixed here, the specific epochs. And then essentially all of these other things, the batch size, which framework you're using as an executor, everything can change. And what we want as a metric is to at least achieve 93% validation accuracy on the maximum step. So not even the final step, but at most, or at least, sorry, 93%. For ResNet 50 on ImageNet, it's not really that different. Not much has changed. The data set here changed to ImageNet, and we have all of these dataset loaders already pre-included with Deep500. All in all, this is only the beginning. Deep500 as a meta framework needs a community to grow. Since this is built for scientific datasets and also scientific computing applications, we would like to see more recipes and more loaders. Our interfaces are very flexible. They can be used to load pretty much anything. And we are currently actively working on improving the ONNX representation so that more of it can become the recipe. So we have a standardized recipe that may be supported by the neural network frameworks themselves. We can use other concepts from high-performance computing to improve training. So we can have other implementations and new algorithms implemented through the Deep500 meta framework. And finally, what would be really interesting as future research is to look at different aggregate scores. For instance, we can rank deep learning algorithms by the number of steps to converge or number of seconds to converge. But it would really be interesting to see if there might be an aggregate metric that you can include correctness, performance, and convergence into one. And I invite you to go to the website. We have a mailing list, we have a GitHub page, and the paper is linked here below. Thank you.